Gotti. John Travolta plays the infamous mob boss. And wow, this thing was a total disaster from day one. Critics tore it apart for its jumbled storytelling, which somehow managed to be both confusing and boring. The timeline jumps all over the place, trying to squeeze decades of Gotti's life into under 2 hours. That decision made everything feel rushed and incomplete. Dialogue was clunky, and scenes that were supposed to be serious came off like bad improv. Travolta gave it his all, but even he couldn't save a script that reads like a parody of mafia dramas. The direction was just as chaotic. Kevin Connolly, best known for acting in a comedy series, was behind the camera, and it showed. It was his third time directing a feature, and this one clearly needed someone more experienced. The tone was all over the place, flipping from sentimental to grim without any build-up. Critics slammed it for glorifying a real-life criminal while not offering any depth or critique. Rotten Tomatoes ended up with 56 critic reviews, and not one of them was positive. That's rare. Even the cinematography couldn't catch a break. It looked like a made-for-TV movie at times. The soundtrack tried way too hard to feel gritty and cool, but it just felt out of place. There were distribution issues too, with delays and last-minute changes. It never stood a chance. The Ridiculous Six. This one had a huge cast and zero charm. Released on a streaming platform in 2015, it was supposed to be a big comedic Western parody. Instead, it became a prime example of everything that can go wrong with a movie. Critics called it lazy, offensive, and painfully unfunny. It clocked in at nearly 2 hours, which only made the bad jokes feel longer. The humor relied heavily on stereotypes, and that didn't sit well with anybody. Several Native American actors actually walked off the set during production because of how disrespectful the content was. Adam Sandler led the cast, and while he's done well with goofy roles before, this wasn't one of them. His performance was flat, and the rest of the characters were just exaggerated caricatures. The plot was barely there, meandering through aimless scenes that felt stitched together by a team of people who'd given up. The script didn't help. Every line tried to be outrageous, but instead it just felt forced and repetitive. Critics said it lacked wit, originality, and even basic structure. Rotten Tomatoes collected 36 reviews, and not one critic gave it a fresh score. The production budget was actually pretty big, but the film looked cheap, like a rushed sketch show that never found a punchline. It was supposed to kick off a deal, but it ended up as a warning sign. By the way, if you guys like movie content like this, I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe. Thanks. One Missed Call. This horror remake from 2008 is often cited as one of the genre's lowest points. Based on a Japanese film, it took all the tension and cleverness of the original and turned it into a soulless mess. The plot centers around people getting voicemails from their future selves, predicting their deaths. It sounds intriguing, but the execution was painfully bad. Critics slammed the film for relying entirely on jump scares and cliches, offering zero suspense or originality. Every horror beat felt recycled from better movies. Shannon Sossamon stars, but she didn't have much to work with. Her character is paper thin, and the script gives her nothing but reaction shots and hollow dialogue. Supporting roles were filled with familiar faces, but none of them made an impression. Direction by Eric Valette lacked style or vision, with bland visuals and clumsy pacing. Even the kills, which should have been creative or disturbing, were completely forgettable. Rotten Tomatoes gathered 79 reviews and not a single one was positive. That's a brutal number, especially for a horror flick, where at least one critic usually finds something redeeming. The film tried to blend supernatural horror with a detective subplot, but it just made things feel disjointed. The worst part? It wasn't scary at all. Just a noisy, poorly lit disaster that failed to capture what made the original work. 1,000 words. Eddie Murphy plays a fast-talking literary agent who suddenly gets cursed. Every word he speaks causes a leaf to fall from a magical tree, and when the last one drops, he dies. Sounds like a creative setup, right? But the film turns that idea into a 90-minute stretch of awkward silence, cheap gags, and predictable moral lessons. Murphy, known for his rapid-fire delivery, is forced into near silence for most of the movie, and the physical comedy just isn't strong enough to carry the weight. The tone is completely confused. It tries to be a heartwarming comedy with a message, but the emotional beats are shallow and rushed. The story pushes themes like family and honesty, but in such an obvious way that it ends up feeling preachy instead of profound. Direction from Brian Robbins lacked focus, bouncing between slapstick and melodrama without ever landing on anything consistent. The pacing was a mess, and the supporting cast didn't have much to do except react to Murphy's silent routine. Dialogue that does exist is bland, and scenes drag on long past their welcome. The movie was filmed in 2008 but didn't release until 2012, and it definitely felt dated by then. What could have been smart commentary turned into a loud whisper of missed potential. Left Behind. Nicolas Cage stars as a pilot caught in the middle of the rapture, and somehow that premise ends up being one of the dullest things ever put to film. It tries to balance disaster movie chaos with religious drama, but neither side works. The pacing is painfully slow, with most of the action taking place inside a plane or in random hallways. For a movie about the end of the world, it's shockingly uneventful. The script is heavy-handed, filled with awkward exposition and lifeless dialogue. Characters constantly explain what's happening instead of reacting like real people. Cage looks confused in almost every scene, like he's not sure what movie he signed on for. The rest of the cast gives flat performances, and there's zero chemistry anywhere. Direction from Vic Armstrong lacked urgency, with scenes dragging on without building tension or emotion. Visual effects looked outdated even by 2014 standards. Car crashes and explosions feel more like stock footage than real danger. Critics pointed out that it was trying to appeal to a specific audience, but even then, it didn't offer anything new or thoughtful. It avoids real questions in favor of cliches, and the ending just fizzles out. There's no payoff, no suspense, just a long flight into boredom with nothing worth remembering. Simon Says. Dennis Rodman stars as an Interpol agent in this action comedy that thinks it's cooler than it is. Released in 1999, it tries to mix spy thriller elements with slapstick humor, and the result is an unwatchable pile of nonsense. The plot revolves around rescuing a kidnapped girl and stopping a weapons deal, but it's so disjointed that it's hard to tell what's going on half the time. Scenes jump from place to place with no logic, like the movie's trying to outrun its own script. Rodman, known more for basketball than acting, delivers lines like he's reading from a cereal box. His character is supposed to be smooth and tough, but instead, he just looks lost in every scene. Dane Cook plays his sidekick, but their chemistry is non-existent, and his performance is somehow even more annoying than usual. The action sequences are lazy, full of bad green screen, and completely unconvincing stunts. The jokes fall flat with one-liners that sound like they were written during a lunch break. Direction from Kevin Elders doesn't help, camera work is messy, editing is choppy, and tone swings wildly between cartoonish and dead serious. Critics tore it apart for lacking any originality, charm, or basic coherence. It tried to be stylish, but ended up being one of the most forgettable and baffling action comedies ever made. Hard Kill. Bruce Willis plays a tech CEO's father dragged into a mission to stop a cyber terrorist from using an advanced AI weapon. Sounds like a setup for something explosive, but this thing barely even flickers. The entire movie feels like it was shot in a single abandoned warehouse, with characters hiding behind crates and trading the same 3 lines of dialogue over and over. The plot's paper thin, stretched across 90 minutes like cold pizza dough. Willis barely shows up. He spends most of his screen time sitting, mumbling vague threats, or just staring into space like he's counting down the minutes. The real lead is Jesse Metcalfe, trying to carry the film with long stares and awkward tactical dialogue. Unfortunately, no one else in the cast brings anything memorable. Every conversation feels like placeholder text that someone forgot to rewrite. Action scenes are repetitive, lots of slow walking, clunky shootouts, and awkward camera angles. There's no momentum, no stakes, just long scenes of characters looking concerned. The direction is flat, the pacing is lifeless, and the lighting looks like they forgot half the equipment. It tries to build tension with techno-thriller buzzwords, but none of it makes sense. Critics pointed out that it felt like a contractual obligation, not a movie. It ends exactly how it plays. Quiet, confusing, and completely forgettable. Dark Crimes. Jim Carrey takes a serious turn here, playing a Polish detective investigating a murder that mirrors a plot from a controversial novel. On paper, it sounds like a moody, psychological thriller, but what hits the screen is slow, dreary, and completely disjointed. The pacing is glacial, with long stretches of silence, dim lighting, and characters brooding in gray hallways. It tries hard to be deep and mysterious, but instead, it just feels empty. Carrey's performance is grim, but not in a compelling way. He whispers through most of his lines, with a lifeless expression that looks more bored than haunted. The character is supposed to be unraveling a dark conspiracy, but the plot is so vague and unfocused that nothing ever feels urgent. Dialogue is stiff with conversations that drag on without revealing anything interesting. The direction, from Alexandros Avranas, leans heavily into slow, atmospheric shots, but without any suspense to back it up. Critics called it pretentious and emotionally hollow. It throws in mature themes without developing them, making it feel edgy for the sake of being edgy. Even the twist, which should have been the payoff, lands flat. It's all mood and no meaning. What could have been a gritty noir ends up feeling like a long, gray yawn with nothing underneath the surface. Super Babies, Baby Geniuses 2. This sequel somehow takes the already bad concept of talking, crime-fighting babies and makes it even worse. Released in 2004, it tries to mix science fiction, slapstick, and superhero nonsense into a kid's movie, but every choice feels like the wrong one. The plot revolves around babies with special powers trying to stop a media mogul from using mind control. Yes, that's the actual premise. It sounds ridiculous, and it plays out even dumber than it sounds. The babies are voiced by adults trying to sound like toddlers, which just makes every line sound creepy or annoying. The visual effects are laughably bad, lip syncing looks like a glitch, and the action scenes are just babies wobbling around in slow motion. Jon Voight plays the villain with a bizarre accent and a rubbery face full of prosthetics, but it's hard to tell what emotion he's going for, or if he even knows. Direction is a total mess. Scenes are overly bright, the pacing is off, and the comedy feels like it was written by someone who's never met a child. It's supposed to be fun and silly, but it ends up being confusing and exhausting. Critics didn't just dislike it, they questioned why it even existed. Everything from sound design to editing felt half-baked. There's no charm, no logic, just 90 minutes of cinematic babysitting gone horribly wrong. The Nutcracker. Also known as The Nutcracker in 3D, this adaptation took a beloved holiday classic and turned it into a baffling dystopian musical with talking rats, clunky CGI, and a tone that's all over the place. Set in 1920, it tries to mix fantasy with historical allegory, and the result is something that manages to be weird, dull, and unsettling all at once. Elle Fanning plays the lead child, and John Turturro is cast as the Rat King, complete with a hairstyle that looks like he lost a bet. The film bizarrely tries to work in themes of totalitarianism and even Holocaust imagery, which feels wildly out of place in a story about a wooden toy. Add in Alan Cumming and Nathan Lane singing awkward songs, and things just keep spiraling into chaos. The script ignores the original ballet's charm and replaces it with long, confusing scenes full of exposition and wooden performances. The special effects look like early 2000s video game cutscenes, and the 3D gimmick is more distracting than immersive. Critics slammed it for being joyless, confusing, and completely tone-deaf. It was supposed to be magical and whimsical, but instead it turned into an overproduced fever dream that leaves you wondering how so many wrong choices were made at once. Nothing lands. And by the end, the only thing anyone wants is for it to stop. Return to the Blue Lagoon. This sequel to the 1980 film tried to recapture the tropical romance of the original, but instead delivered a lifeless rehash, with less charm, worse acting, and a script that feels like it was written during a beach nap. Mila Jovovich and Brian Krause star as two teens stranded on an island, growing up together and discovering love in the least believable way possible. The dialogue is stilted, the pacing drags, and the chemistry between the leads is about as natural as a plastic palm tree. The film recycles the entire structure of the first movie, but with even less to say. Scenes that should feel intimate or emotional are just awkward, with characters making grand declarations while staring blankly into the ocean. The narration tries to sound poetic, but ends up sounding like it's quoting from a discount calendar. Direction by William Graham leans heavily on long, slow shots of the island, probably to distract from how little is actually happening. Critics didn't hold back, they called it shallow, pointless, and tonally confused. It tries to be innocent and sensual at the same time, and fails at both. Even the music, which should have added mood, ends up making scenes feel more melodramatic. There's no real conflict, no interesting dialogue, just two people in paradise, somehow making it look miserable. Cabin Fever. This one's a shot-for-shot remake of the 2002 original, but with all the edge, grit, and weirdness drained out. It uses the same script as the original, literally the same dialogue, but somehow manages to make everything feel flatter and way less fun. The plot is still about a group of friends going to a remote cabin and slowly falling apart thanks to a flesh-eating virus, but this version plays it painfully straight. The original had a bizarre energy that helped it stand out, but this remake swaps that out for bland acting and lifeless direction. The cast is full of forgettable performances. Nobody really feels like they're in danger, even while their skin is melting off. Scenes that were once shocking or darkly funny are now just awkward or gross without any payoff. Director Travis Aruni doesn't bring any new ideas or perspective to the table. The gore is still there, but without the original's twisted humor or weird personality, it just feels like empty splatter. Critics pointed out that it wasn't just a bad remake, it was a pointless one. Every scene looks cheaper, every moment feels less intense, and the whole thing comes off like a dull imitation of something that didn't need copying. It's not scary, it's not clever, and it definitely didn't need to exist. Gold Diggers. Released in 2004, this so-called comedy follows two broke losers who hatch a plan to marry a pair of elderly sisters for their money. What sounds like a setup for absurd hijinks quickly turns into a relentless stream of bad jokes, creepy dialogue, and scenes that feel like deleted clips from a much worse movie. It tries to be edgy and outrageous, but just ends up being mean-spirited and gross without any actual humor. The leads, played by Will Friedle and Chris Owen, are stuck delivering some of the most painfully unfunny lines ever written. Their characters are cartoonishly dumb, but not in a charming way, more in a please-make-it-stop way. The older women, meant to be quirky and unpredictable, are given one-note personalities that revolve entirely around slapstick violence and uncomfortable innuendo. It's not just unfunny, it's hard to watch. The direction is sloppy, pacing is non-existent, and every scene feels dragged out for way too long. Critics didn't just dislike it, they actively questioned how it was made at all. It has no wit, no charm, and no purpose beyond trying to shock people with how tasteless it can be. National Lampoon's name is on the poster, but this thing has none of the spirit or cleverness of earlier films. It's a chaotic, brain-melting misfire from start to finish. Max Steel. Based on a toy line and animated series, this film tried to launch a superhero franchise and instead delivered a masterclass in how to make origin stories feel like homework. The plot follows teenager Max McGrath discovering he can generate energy and teaming up with a floating robot named Steel. Together, they become a single hero named Max Steel. The movie spends nearly the entire runtime explaining this over and over, with exposition so dense it feels like a science lesson written in crayon. The acting is stiff across the board. Ben Winchell plays Max like he's constantly confused, and Maria Bello and Andy Garcia are completely wasted in supporting roles that amount to little more than awkward dialogue delivery machines. The supposed bond between Max and Steel, which should have been the emotional core, comes off forced and weirdly unemotional. The special effects aren't impressive either. Most of the action scenes look like video game cutscenes from a decade earlier, with choppy visuals and no sense of scale. The villain appears so late in the movie that there's no real threat or tension, just a rushed fight scene followed by a bland conclusion. Critics called it dull, generic, and hopelessly forgettable. Instead of launching a franchise, it quietly disappeared, leaving behind a trail of blue, glowing nonsense and wasted potential. Dark Tide. Halle Berry stars as a shark expert haunted by a past tragedy, and somehow the movie still manages to be the least thrilling shark film ever made. Released in 2012, it promises oceanic tension and underwater danger, but delivers slow pacing, murky visuals, and a plot that circles the drain like a forgotten bathtub. The entire story is basically Barry's character being convinced to guide a reckless billionaire on a dangerous shark dive, and then spending the rest of the movie looking anxious about it. Barry tries her best, but the script gives her almost nothing to work with, just recycled lines about fear, redemption, and the sea. The dialogue is stiff, the character arcs are non-existent, and the pacing is unbelievably sluggish. It takes forever for anything remotely dramatic to happen, and when it does, the payoff is weak. The other characters are flat and forgettable, with motivations that make no sense and conversations that go nowhere. The direction from John Stockwell focuses so much on the scenery that he forgets to build tension. Shark scenes are few and far between, and when they do show up, they're underwhelming and short. Critics pointed out that it lacked suspense, cohesion, and anything resembling excitement. For a thriller about shark diving, it somehow manages to feel like a long, awkward vacation slideshow. Beautiful locations with absolutely nothing happening. Beneath the Darkness, Dennis Quaid stars as a small-town mortician with a dark secret, and even he can't inject life into this limp horror thriller. The plot follows a group of teens who suspect Quaid's character of hiding something sinister in his creepy mansion, but everything unfolds with the suspense of a soggy sandwich. It's got the setup for a solid ghost story, but wasted on cliches, clunky dialogue, and characters who act like they've never seen a horror movie. Quaid swings for the fences with an over-the-top performance that ends up feeling cartoonish next to the film's dead serious tone. He dances with a corpse at one point, which should have been creepy or shocking, but it just feels ridiculous. The teens, who should be driving the tension, spend most of the movie making bad decisions and delivering flat lines. There's no chemistry, no charm, just awkward scenes stitched together by a script that's desperate to be taken seriously. The direction is stiff, the scares are predictable, and the pacing drags like it's walking through molasses. Critics pointed out how the tone shifts wildly, with moments that should be scary, turning unintentionally funny. It tries to build mystery but never delivers anything satisfying. It ends up being less horror and more snooze, with one of the most forgettable finales in the genre. A thriller with no thrills and a title that's sadly accurate. Staying Alive. John Travolta returns as Tony Manero in this sequel to Saturday Night Fever, and it's wild how he both kicks off and closes this list with two totally different cinematic disasters. Directed by Sylvester Stallone, this movie tries to show Tony's journey from disco king to Broadway dancer, but instead turns into a slow-motion ego trip set to synth music and unnecessary shirtlessness. The plot is a shallow collection of dance rehearsals, bad relationship drama, and overblown musical numbers. Tony spends most of the film strutting, pouting, or flexing, and the script gives him zero development. He's supposed to be more mature now, but he comes off as arrogant and clueless. The love triangle is laughable, and the dialogue is full of melodramatic nonsense like, "You can't even feel unless you're hurt," which sounds deep until you realize it means absolutely nothing. Stallone's direction leans heavily into style over substance. Slow motion, fog machines, and aggressive lighting are used to make everything seem epic, but it just looks like a music video gone wrong. Critics didn't buy it for a second. They called it shallow, ridiculous, and totally disconnected from the gritty charm of the original. The final dance sequence tries to be triumphant, but ends up being unintentionally hilarious. It's all flash, no soul, and somehow the perfect bookend to this beautiful mess of a 0% parade. If you enjoyed this, I'm going to be posting a lot here. I would greatly appreciate it if you could subscribe. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.